This is the Chronicle of the Unnamed Guardian. In the earliest days of the Great Convergence, when the world of Valsidia was still raw and bleeding from the collision of realities, when borders were meaningless and safety was a luxury afforded to none, the western reaches of the land were consumed by chaos absolute. The chaos peaks and wastes stretched endlessly, a scarred and tortured landscape where the sky itself seemed to weep with confusion, and the earth groaned beneath the weight of impossible change. Here, in the deepest and most forsaken cave, carved into the highest and most inhospitable peak, lived a creature that defied all classification. He was born of the convergence itself, a fusion that should never have been possible. The disciplined celestial biology of a lizardman Saurus warrior, cold-blooded and built for war, merged at some fundamental level with the terrifying bioengineered horror of a tyrannid hive tyrant. The result was a being of staggering physical presence. He stood twice the height of any common lizard man or lizard folk, his frame massive and armored with overlapping scales that bore the chitinous reinforcement of tyrannid biology. His eyes held an unsettling dual nature, the cold calculating intelligence of the Saurus alongside something vast and ancient that spoke of the hive mind's cosmic hunger. Yet somehow, impossibly, inexplicably, neither nature had consumed the other. He was both, and he was neither. He was simply himself, and himself was something the world wanted nothing to do with. The lizardmen of Cathar Gur had cast him out before he could speak his first word. The Slan mage priests, those ancient and cosmic beings who perceived the great plan in the movements of stars, had looked upon him and seen something that did not fit, something unwritten, something that existed outside the celestial calculations. He was an anomaly, and anomalies were dangerous. The Saurus warriors who drove him from the temple cities did not hate him. They simply could not comprehend him, and what cannot be comprehended cannot be permitted within the ordered society of the lizard men. The lizard folk of the swamps and jungles fled from him on instinct, their primal senses screaming warnings about the tyrannid essence that clung to his form like a second skin. Even the great beasts of the wilderness, creatures that feared nothing, gave his territory a wide and respectful berth. And so he lived alone. For years beyond counting in those early chaotic days, he existed in his cave among the chaos peaks, watching the world tear itself apart below him. He hunted when hungry, slept when tired, and endured the howling winds of the wastes with the patient stoicism of a creature who had never known anything different. He had no name, for names are given by others, and there were no others who wished to be close enough to give him one. He did not know what loneliness was. He had no framework for the concept. But sometimes on nights when the chaos storms lit the sky with impossible colors, he would sit at the mouth of his cave and watch the distant lights of settlements far below, flickering like dying embers against the vast darkness. And something deep within the Saurus portion of his being would stir, something that the cold logic of his nature could not entirely suppress. He watched, he waited, he endured. And then came the Halflings. They arrived in the chaos of a dying afternoon, when the light was failing and the western winds carried the stench of skaven musk and warpstone. There were perhaps 40 of them, maybe more, a ragged and desperate column of small folk who had been walking for days beyond their endurance. Halflings and gnomes intermingled, their natural partnership evident even in catastrophe. They carried their wounded on makeshift stretchers fashioned from cloaks and broken spear shafts. Children clung to the backs of adults. The elderly were supported by the young. They moved with the desperate unity of people who had already lost too much and refused to lose more. They had set out from the eastern settlements weeks prior, a brave and determined community seeking a place to call their own in the chaos of the new world. They had heard rumors of fertile fields and defensible positions in the Oakhaven region, a place where small folk might build something lasting. But the journey had been brutal beyond their worst imaginings. Monster attacks had claimed lives and shattered their confidence. Warbands of Khorne berserkers had forced them north and west away from their intended path, and now, behind them, growing louder with every passing moment, came the chittering, squealing, scratching tide of a Skaven horde. The Skaven had been tracking them for 2 days. Patient, cunning, and utterly merciless, the Ratmen had herded the Halflings deliberately, cutting off southern routes, blocking eastern paths, funneling them steadily toward the Chaos Peaks where no sane creature ventured. It was a hunting strategy of cold efficiency, and it was working perfectly. The Halfling Elder, a stout and weathered woman whose name the records do not preserve, made the decision that saved and nearly doomed them simultaneously. She saw the cave mouth in the failing light, a dark opening in the cliff face large enough to shelter all of them. She ordered the column forward, reasoning that any shelter was better than the open ground where the Skaven would cut them apart. They poured into the cave entrance, the wounded first, then the children, then the fighters forming a rear guard against the approaching horde. Torches were lit with trembling hands, casting dancing orange light across the cave walls. And then someone at the front of the column screamed. The torchlight had found him. He was at the back of the cave, motionless, watching them with those vast and unsettling eyes. In the flickering light, he was every nightmare the Halflings had ever conceived, given physical form. Massive beyond comprehension, his scaled and chitinous form filling the rear of the cave like a living wall. The tyrannid aspects of his biology were particularly pronounced in the torchlight, the bioorganic plating, the subtle wrongness of his silhouette, the sense of something alien and incomprehensible looking back at them through eyes that held no recognizable emotion. The Elder made her second decision in as many minutes. She turned the column around, back into the Skaven. The reasoning was sound in its desperate way. The Skaven were a known evil. They were numerous and vicious, but they were comprehensible. They could be fought, bargained with, perhaps even fled from. The thing in the cave was something else entirely, something that belonged to the category of threats that small folk had no framework for surviving. They poured back out of the cave mouth and directly into the leading edge of the Skaven horde. The fighting was immediate and savage. Halfling militia, exhausted and already wounded, formed desperate shield walls against a tide of ratmen that outnumbered them 5-1. Gnome tinkerers hurled improvised explosive devices that scattered Skaven but could not stop the advance. Children screamed. The wounded who could not fight were dragged to the center of the formation, protected by a ring of bodies that grew thinner with every passing moment. The Elder fought with a short sword and the fury of someone who had already decided this was the end. She cut down 2 Skaven before a third opened a gash across her arm. She kept fighting. They were going to die here. Every halfling and gnome in that desperate formation understood it with the clarity that comes only in the final moments. They were going to die in the shadow of the Chaos Peaks, far from the fertile fields they had dreamed of, their names unremembered and their community unbuilt. And then the ground shook. He came through the cave mouth like a force of nature given direction. The Unnamed one moved with a speed that seemed impossible for his size, crossing the distance between the cave and the battle in heartbeats. The Skaven at the rear of the horde had perhaps 1 second of warning before he arrived among them. What followed was not a battle. It was a reckoning. His physical power was beyond anything the Skaven had encountered. The Saurus warrior biology gave him combat instincts honed by celestial design, every movement efficient and devastating. The tyrannid aspects gave him a physical resilience that bordered on supernatural, his body absorbing damage that would have felled lesser creatures and continuing without pause. He moved through the Skaven horde like a tide moving through sand, unstoppable and absolute. Skaven died by the dozen. Their warpstone weapons sparked against his chitinous plating and accomplished nothing. Their numbers, usually their greatest advantage, became a liability as they crowded each other in their panic, unable to bring their full force to bear against something that simply would not stop. The Halflings, for their part, had no idea what was happening. From their perspective, the monster from the cave had emerged and was now among them. The chaos of the battle made it impossible to track individual movements, to understand that the massive form crashing through the Skaven was moving in patterns that consistently placed itself between the rat men and the halfling wounded. They saw only size and violence and the terrifying alien nature of the creature. They attacked him. Short swords bounced off his scales, gnome-crafted crossbow bolts found gaps in his plating, and drew blood that was darker than it should have been. A halfling militia captain, brave beyond all reasonable measure, climbed onto a rock and drove a spear into the creature's shoulder with both hands and every ounce of his considerable determination. The unnamed one did not retaliate. He did not turn. He did not acknowledge the attacks beyond the involuntary flinch of a body registering pain. He simply continued his work, moving through the Skaven, protecting the small folk who were simultaneously trying to kill him, his attention never wavering from the enemies that actually threatened their lives. The Skaven broke first. They always do when the calculus of survival tips against them. The horde that had seemed so overwhelming moments before dissolved into fleeing individuals, each rat-man making the personal decision that whatever prize the halflings represented was not worth dying for. They vanished into the darkness of the Chaos Peaks, their chittering fading into the distance. Silence fell. The halflings stood in the aftermath, breathing hard, surrounded by fallen Skaven and the evidence of a battle that should have killed them all. The unnamed one stood at the edge of the group, his massive form still, watching the darkness where the Skaven had fled. The spear was still in his shoulder. He had not removed it. The militia captain stared at the spear, then at the creature, then at the spear again. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Weapons remained drawn, shields remained raised, but the attacks had stopped. The halflings looked at one another with the dawning and deeply uncomfortable realization that they had been fighting the wrong enemy for the last several minutes. The elder, her wounded arm bound with a strip of her own cloak, stepped forward to the front of the group. She studied the unnamed one with eyes that had seen enough of the world to recognize something true when it stood before her. She saw the wounds they had inflicted. She saw that he had not responded to them. She saw the Skaven dead arranged, not randomly, but in patterns that consistently showed a creature that had placed itself between the horde and the halfling wounded. She opened her mouth to speak, and then a child pushed through the crowd. She was perhaps 8 years old by halfling reckoning, small even by the standards of her small people, her face streaked with dirt and dried tears, and the particular expression of a child who has been terrified for so long that the fear has burned itself out and left something simpler behind. She had lost her parents 2 days prior to a monster attack. She had walked every mile since in the care of the community, held by whoever was nearest, fed from whatever could be spared. She walked through the gap between the adults, past the drawn weapons and the raised shields, across the blood-soaked ground, and stopped at the foot of the unnamed one. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. Then she wrapped her arms around his leg, pressed her face against the scales and chitin, and wept. Not the desperate sobbing of panic, but the deep and exhausted crying of someone who has finally, after a very long time, felt safe. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was very small against the vast silence of the Chaos Peaks. "Thank you for saving us." The unnamed one was still for a long moment. Something moved behind those vast and alien eyes, something that the Slan mage priests had not accounted for in their celestial calculations, something that the tyrannid hive mind had no category for, something that existed in the space between the cold order of the lizard men and the consuming hunger of the swarm. He lowered his massive head, slowly, carefully, until it was level with the child. He regarded her with an expression that no one present could fully interpret, but that everyone present somehow understood. The elder watched this and made her third and greatest decision. She sheathed her sword. One by one, the halflings and gnomes followed. Weapons were lowered. Shields were grounded. The militia captain reached up and gently removed the spear from the creature's shoulder, then stood holding it with an expression of profound embarrassment. They made camp that night in the cave, the halflings and gnomes tending their wounded, while the unnamed one sat at the entrance, watching the darkness. He did not sleep. He did not need to be asked. He simply watched, and nothing came near them in the night. In the morning, the elder approached him with a bowl of food, the best they had remaining. She held it up to him. He looked at it for a long moment, then at her, then accepted it with a gentleness that seemed impossible in hands built for destruction. They stayed 3 days in the cave while the wounded recovered enough to travel. During those 3 days, the halflings and gnomes learned things about their protector. They learned that he communicated not in words but in actions, in the careful positioning of his body, in the direction of his gaze, in the subtle language of a creature who had never needed speech because there had never been anyone to speak to. They learned that he was patient beyond mortal comprehension, that he could sit motionless for hours watching the horizon. They learned that the child who had hugged his leg had claimed a permanent position at his side, and that he permitted this with something that looked remarkably like contentment. On the second day, the elder sat beside him at the cave entrance and spoke to him at length, not knowing how much he understood, but feeling that the speaking itself was important. She told him about Oakhaven, about the fields they sought, about the community they intended to build. She told him that small folk needed protection in a world that was large and dangerous and frequently unkind. She told him that they had not been kind to him and that she was sorry for it. He listened to all of this without moving. When she finished, he turned and looked at her with those vast eyes, and she had the distinct impression that he had understood every word. On the third day, when the column prepared to move, the elder turned to find him already positioned at the front of the group, facing the direction of Oakhaven, waiting. They gave him his name on the journey. It emerged organically the way true names always do, through repetition and affection and the gradual accumulation of meaning. The child who had hugged his leg began calling him Koroth, a halfling word with no precise translation, but carrying the combined meaning of great shelter and he who stands between. The names spread through the group like warmth, and by the time they reached the fertile fields of Oakhaven, it was simply who he was, Koroth. The establishment of the halfling and gnome community in Oakhaven Fields is recorded elsewhere in the Chronicles of Valsidia. What those records note consistently and without exception is that from the very first day of settlement, there was never a successful attack upon that community. Monsters that prowled the surrounding lands gave the fields a wide berth. Skaven scouts who ventured near did not return to report. Warbands that might have seen the small folk as easy prey found reasons to seek easier targets elsewhere. Koroth stood at the borders of Oakhaven Fields and watched. He watched through seasons and years and the long turning of Valsidia's troubled history. He watched as the community grew, as children were born and elders passed, as buildings rose and roads were laid and the halflings and gnomes built something permanent and good in a world that had seemed determined to prevent exactly that. He was present at every naming ceremony, every harvest celebration, every moment of community significance. He did not participate in the way the halflings did, with food and song and the particular exuberant joy of small folk at peace. But he was there, always at the edge, always watching, his presence a constant and immovable fact of life in Oakhaven Fields. The child who had first embraced him grew up with him at her side. She became a leader of her community, wise and compassionate, and it was widely understood that much of her wisdom came from years of sitting beside Korath and learning the particular kind of patience that only an immortal guardian can teach. When she was very old, she would sit at his feet in the evenings, as she had done as a child, and speak to him about the day's events. He would listen, as he always had, with those vast and ancient eyes, reflecting the firelight of a community that existed because he had chosen, in one chaotic and violent moment, to stand between the small and the terrible. He never left. The records of Valsidia, spanning generations of halfling and gnome history in Oakhaven, contain no account of Korath's absence. He is simply always there, a permanent feature of the landscape, as much a part of Oakhaven as the fields themselves. The Unnamed One had been given a name. The forgotten creature had been given a home. The shunned abomination had been given a family. And in return he gave them something that no wall or weapon or alliance could fully provide. He gave them safety, absolute, unwavering, eternal safety. Thus is recorded the Chronicle of Korath, the unnamed guardian, protector of Oakhaven Fields, in the official annals of Valsidia. Let his name be spoken with reverence in every halfling home. Let his story be told to every child at every fireside. Let the world know that compassion can emerge from the most unexpected places, and that family is not determined by blood or race or the circumstances of one's birth. It is determined by who stands between you and the darkness, and Korath always stood between.